Okay, good morning, everybody. You're watching Barnyards and Backyards Live. Welcome, and we're glad that you have joined us today. I'm Jeff Edwards. I work for the University of Wyoming Extension, and I'm located in Goshen County. And my co-host is Jeremiah Vardaman. He is an extension educator up in Powell area. And our guest today is Whit Stewart. Welcome, Whit. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yes, we're glad you're here. Whit is he's an extension specialist for the University of Wyoming with focus on sheep and wool production in the state. So our topic today is, of course, sheep and wool. And I would like to also mention Jenny Thompson. She's also an extension specialist for the University of Wyoming. She is our technical person. She keeps us in line. She keeps us on track, and every once in a while, you may hear her voice and those types of things that go along with it. So, some rules for the day and some things to keep in mind if you're new to Zoom. There is a Q. If you scroll over the top of the surface of Zoom with your mouse, there's a Q&A button down at the bottom. If you have questions, please enter your questions there or in the chat area, and we will try to get them if they are on subject. The other thing is that we are also broadcasting live on Facebook, and if folks have questions there and want to post them, Jenny will pull them off and send them our direction. So, Jeremiah, did I get everything?
I think you hit everything. I think we're ready to roll.
First time
it's a good
ever.
Friday, man.
So, Whit, we're going to turn the floor over to you. However you'd like to start, whatever you'd like to talk about, it's all yours.
Yeah, great. Well, again, thanks for having me, and I'll give my best effort to make this as conversational as possible. I think there's some, when you put together a Sheep 101 class, when you've studied sheep for this long and grew up with them, you sometimes get lost in the weeds. So I'll try to stay, in the real world with some of the discussion today. But I just encourage folks, if they have questions, to feel free to answer. As I thought about what to talk about and what's most beneficial, I think a lot of what I have put together today is for more of the lay audience and those that are thinking about adding either a small scale sheep enterprise or an enterprise in addition to an existing livestock enterprise, just some things to think about. There's a lot of details in nutrition, reproduction, diseases, breeding and selection that, we spend semesters teaching. But I think really the beauty of sheep production is that it can be tailored to what your goals are. And with that, I guess we talk about the wide variety of sheep producers in Wyoming, and there are a wide variety of sheep producers. Those with a few head of sheep that they like to harvest the wool to do some hand spinning, those that offer a freezer lamb type of a product. There's 4-H market lamb projects and breeding projects. And then there's our large-scale operators that provide a majority of the lamb and wool to the industry. And so you can imagine addressing that spectrum of questions. I think I've heard a lot of it, but I know I haven't heard it all. But
so Whit, if I don't have any livestock yet, and I've been contemplating, I've been thinking about the possibility of sheep. How do I even get started? What do I need to do in order to set myself up to make sure that they stay on my property, to make sure that I'm feeding them correctly? What do I need to do to just start a flock?
Or to even decide if it's a good idea for me to have.
Or even decide if it's a good idea. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a great question. I think that has to be asked first. What are my goals? How do they align with my lifestyle goals? I realize a lot of folks with a smaller acreage or ranchette, clearly they don't have land resources to make it a large-scale commercial enterprise, but they can still incorporate aspects that are profitable. But really those lifestyle goals, and I think asking questions like, do I want to spend a lot of time working with the sheep? There's certain breeds that are more amenable to little less inputs. For example, if you don't like wool and you don't want to deal with shearing of wool, there's different breeds of sheep called hair sheep that actually shed and would eliminate that need, right? In contrast, if you're someone that wants to produce, have sheep for a targeted grazing enterprise, I have some slides that I will share with you, some targeted grazing businesses, just to manage vegetation in your community or in your ranchette surrounding you. I mean, there's a lot of different end goals really that need to be considered before you even get started, because so often, and we're all guilty of it, we oftentimes love the idea of something, but if we ask ourselves questions like, do we enjoy working with the livestock? Are we hands-on? Do we have a comfort level handling livestock? Do we like lambing ewes? I mean, a large part of this is there's a difference between purchasing a feeder lamb that you can finish and put in your freezer versus running a flock of ewes with a ram and being set up for lambing. And so really, again, what are your limitations? What are your goals is probably the first step.
Are hair sheep good meat producers?
Yes.
Okay.
So there's some differences with hair sheep and wool sheep. Obviously, as the name implies, one shed and one has to be shorn. The hair with hair sheep breeds is not usable. It's a hollow fiber. It doesn't take dye very well. It's brittle. So the fiber aspect is eliminated. But the other real major difference with hair sheep is that they're a little bit smaller framed. Mature ewes average probably 120, 130 pounds on the high end with hair sheep. With wool sheep breeds that we have available, a lot of sheep in our area are upwards of 160 pound mature ewe body weight. By the way, a ewe is a female sheep. And so that is a major difference. But again, yeah, they've been developed for meat production. They have a smaller carcass, but the meat is excellent. And they're actually gaining a lot of traction in the Southern Plains in Texas. And there is some hair sheep breeders here in Wyoming, and they actually do quite well.
Interesting.
So on that breed, let me just share something with you. Going back to that lifestyle question, I threw up on my screen here. I follow a lot of different sheep production forums on Facebook. This one actually comes out of Canada, but you'll see at the top there. Can you guys see the text?
I don't see that you're sharing yet. What?
Oh, okay. All right. Bear with me one sec. I'll make sure that I share that. Because, yeah, this is something to think about from the standpoint of what do we want to accomplish? And these are some extremes that you might deal with. Can you see it now?
Yes, yes.
All right.
If you want to make it full screen, we'll be able to see it a little better.
Okay. All right, there we go. So at the top there, you should be able to see, this is an example of a really high production flock. These are out of a prolific ewe breed, the Canadian Arcot Rideau up north, very similar to a U.S. breed that we have called the Polypay. But what I want you to focus on is up top. So this is a narrative from a producer up there. I said, finished our March-April lambing, 282 ewes total, 764 lambs alive and tagged. That's a 266% lamb crop.
Wow.
11% of those were artificially raised, which meant they have to be raised on a bottle or a milking system that's not the ewe. And it says all in 19 days with a team of 5 on shifts. So that represents probably one of the more productive extremes. Not saying everyone wants to do that.
Yeah, typically we think of one lamb per ewe, right? Is that more typical?
Well, yeah, I think our national lamb crop in our neck of the woods is about 1.07 lambs per ewe, right? We don't have half lambs, but that's about 107% lamb crop usually as a national average.
Those lambs are named Horatio.
Yes.
Right? Poor Horatio.
That's right.
Well, and what that means is that some ewes are going to lose lambs, right? Some are going to have singles, and some will have doubles or triplets, and those doubles and triplets will make up for the ones that are possibly lost, correct?
Yes, and then there's the breed aspect. There's certain breeds that have been selected to consistently give you twins and triplets. And those breeds are really popular in the Midwest and the East Coast where I come from, where we have a lot of grass. We have a lot of farming systems that can support that level of production. here we have flocks here in Wyoming actually that are producing 200% lamb crops. As you can imagine, with that level of lactation, that level of fetuses that those ewes carry, it requires some good nutrition. And so some more inputs you should expect with that kind of production. But this is an example of the extreme, right? The other extreme is very low input, don't feed them a tremendous amount. They graze on dormant rangelands and produce 100% lamb crop. That's a generic scenario for a lot of our lower input, larger scale producers here in the state. But our benchmark really should be for about 150% weaning crop. I mean, that's a high benchmark for some people, but that's one of the merits of sheep. Is that you can,
a question for you, Whit. So this extreme situation, 282 ewes. Can you give us an average or a ballpark of how many acres I would need to run that many sheep?
Oh boy.
Gonna put you on the spot right off at first.
It all depends on animal
way to
units,
throw me
right?
a softball, Jeremiah. Yeah. So,
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is this a large producer? Is this a medium producer? Is this something I could do on small land ownership of 10 acres or 15 acres?
Yeah, here in Wyoming, I'd say in the absence of being in a basin where there's some good feed available at a cost competitive price and running on irrigated acres, this is probably more of a confinement type operation that we see, right? They lamb their ewes. They do have access to pasture, but it's limited. And they don't always, it's more of a house system, I guess you could say. To have this level of production in Wyoming, I'd say that we'd be restricted to certain areas in the state where we just have good farming. So up in your neck of the woods, this is not unattainable by any means in the basin. Mm-hmm. From a grazing perspective, we don't necessarily have those resources to have this level of production as a grazing operation here in Wyoming.
So Whit, on this slide that you're sharing, does this one ewe in the lower left-hand corner, did she have 5 lambs?
Yes. Based on my knowledge of this particular post, it's not uncommon for sheep to have quads from time to time, especially with certain breeds of sheep. Another phenomenon with sheep that I should mention is that if we increase the level of nutrition during the breeding season, sheep actually ovulate more and can give you more lambs born. And so we refer to that as flushing. And that's another effect, both genetics, you can produce that many lambs in one litter, but you also can produce that due to how you manipulate the feed during the breeding season to affect their ovulation rate.
So talking about that, Whit, how many lambs should a ewe be expected to raise on her own without supplemental milk or that?
Yeah, that threshold would vary whether you're a range operator versus you're a farm flock operator. I think our standard is that a ewe, if given the right nutrition, should raise 2 lambs. That's kind of our industry standard. You see these logos of sheep enterprises. You'll see 2 lambs standing next to a ewe. That's what we aim for.
Okay.
A good rule of thumb is usually that the first lamb usually will pay for all your fixed and variable costs for the year, and that twin lamb is all pretty much profit for you. That's a generic rule of thumb, but that's what we strive for. Now, obviously, if we've got a breed of sheep that is really well suited to our environment, we don't have a lot of supplemental feed that we provide, and they're asked to do well on winter range, I wouldn't expect that ewe to do more than raising a single. And so it's really about your resources. And I know that's a what if scenario, but I often say that because it does go back to what are your feed resources, your regional feed resources, and then your labor resources. You can't overstate the burden that it is artificially raising orphan lambs unless you have an automated machine and they make those to provide milk to those lambs. But that's a lot of work. And
can you give us an example of that, like on a daily basis? Like, what would that mean for me if I had a bum lamb that I had to raise?
Yeah, well, early on, the first couple days of life, hopefully they got enough colostrum before you picked them up from the ranch. But that's feeding every 4 hours is kind of a gold standard the first week.
It's like going back to childcare then.
That's right.
And some of us aren't out of it yet there, Whit. You're scaring me.
Yeah, well, again, it is a good good solution for young kids, right? I mean, caring for newborn lambs, I think if they want to go do it, that is a resource. But, you know, as they get older, every 8 hours, you can move feeding those lambs too. But they also make an automated milk machine called the Lactec. And a lot of our larger operations, rather than have to find a home for those orphan lambs, they're now keeping those orphan lambs, and they put them on this automated machine that heats the milk, that allows the sheep to mimic a normal eating pattern on a ewe, to eat small meals all throughout the day, right? And then you don't get that pot-bellied orphan lamb-looking appearance that you do when you raise orphan lambs. And so there's different solutions to doing that, but it's not always glamorous, and any sheep producer will attest to the fact that they prefer probably just to have the orphan lambs be raised elsewhere.
So again, on your example here, if they had 764 lambs and 11% were artificially raised, you're talking almost 80 lambs for this operation, and you're feeding 80 individuals every 4 hours.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah.
There you go. There you go, Jeremiah. There's your dad situation right there.
Right. Overwhelming situation.
But that being said, again, you know, orphan lambs are a part of sheep production, right? I mean, if we select for more lambs born per ewe, there's just scenarios where certain ewes just can't raise those lambs. We would expect our yearlings or our first-time lambing ewes to have a good single, both from a milk production standpoint and a mothering standpoint. They struggle sometimes to maintain multiple lambs. And so oftentimes producers will try and graft a lamb onto another ewe. If you do that early on and have some good resources to do that, that works. So they don't automatically become orphans that you have to artificially rear. So there's various ways to manage it, and sheep producers have been doing it pretty expertly for a while, especially our shed lambing flocks. I mean, they will take a triplet-born litter. They will keep the two most healthy on one, and then there might have been a lamb or ewe in the flock that lost a lamb, and then she would inherit that lamb. And it's a good way to spread out your costs that you've paid to keep that ewe in production all through the year. So you want her to be raising a lamb. And so there are ways to not just automatically make them bum lambs, but I would be disingenuous and lying if I said you wouldn't be raising orphan lambs if you were getting into the sheep business.
Right. So Whit, going back to Jeff's first question of where do I start if I'm new to this, I'm interested in sheep and that. I guess one thing that comes to my mind is you probably need to fence the property. Yes. Right. You need to keep the sheep on you, and probably most likely most of our buck rail fence, our wire fence is not going to really keep the sheep in unless it's sheep panels or woven wire.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Let me go ahead and move to that slide real quick. I just want to show you guys, I put together some examples of fencing scenarios. You know, fencing options, obviously, again, go back to what resources are available. I've always encouraged small acreage people that are starting in the sheep business to prioritize a really good perimeter fence that's woven wire. I mean, in sheep production, it's obviously keeping the sheep in, but it's also keeping your neighbor's dogs and predators out. And that can't be overemphasized enough. Is a good perimeter fence that can keep out risk of predators. There's no fence unless you're a millionaire and can put a 12-foot fence up to keep all predators out. But the woven wire is perhaps our gold standard. I recommend that on the perimeter, but a really good option is electronet fence. Once you've established a good perimeter and you can tack up that woven wire fence onto your rail and panel fence or building it separately, there's a good way to really subdivide pastures if you have them. That's the electronet fence. Can you see my screen? Is that still being shown?
Yeah, it looks good.
Yeah. So this actually is a product that has gained a lot of popularity over the past 15 years because it allows operations to be flexible in the grazing availability that they have. I think one real unexploited realm for people wanting to get in the small scale sheep business is a targeted grazing operation. And I'll go back to talking about that in a sec, but this electronet fence is really good because it's portable. But if you are able, and it's not terribly difficult to keep a good charge on this fence, it is excellent at keeping sheep in and also keeping predators out. And I have an example of a targeted grazing business up in Montana that exclusively used this and had zero problems with predators because of it.
What kind of predators are you talking about, Whit?
Yeah, you know, for those that are close to town and that are in close proximity to neighbors, I think domestic dogs are the greatest challenge we have. You know, coyotes are obviously up there in a first or second place in terms of major predators. But what was really interesting about this is that black and white braid, and you can't really see it on the fence here, but it really allows predators and sheep to contrast that barrier and differentiate it, and have to cross their mind saying, wow, maybe I don't want to go in there. And the experience that I've had working with producers that use this is, with the exception of grizzly bears and cougars maybe sometimes, this is a really effective fence to keep out predators. But most importantly, it allows you to pick up some grazing ground that just probably is going unused on your neighbor's place. And it's good exercise putting it up. I put up a lot of it growing up on our farm in Western New York. But it creates resources that you normally wouldn't have if you had to invest thousands of dollars in a permanent fencing system.
But it does take a little bit of time to set it up, but it's not difficult.
It's not difficult. It's, you know, if you have a four-wheeler, a side-by-side, you throw on the roll, it rolls out. Those posts are braided into it every 12 feet. So you just step them in the ground, and then you'd have a charger that puts an electric charge on the fence. You need to pound in a couple of ground rods, but it's really simple. Once you set it up once or twice, you're an expert on it. Now there is some upfront cost, right? 164-foot rolls, $125, but
that's not terrible.
It's not terrible.
I mean, compared to a permanent fence, which could easily get close to 1,000 or more, depending on how far you had to go with it, right? Mm-hmm. So that's pretty good.
Absolutely. So, I mean, that's the other aspect that, you know, you asked the question, how do I get started? The beauty of sheep production is it doesn't require a tremendous amount of capital outlay. I mean, I've worked with producers that got their start buying bum lambs for $25, $10 a piece, raising those female bum lambs up and starting their flock. And, you know, it doesn't have to be going to the bank and getting a $100,000 promissory note to operate.
So another question for you, Whit. If I own small acreage, maybe 5, 10, 15 acres, right? Mm-hmm. What is a good number to start with? Should I be looking at lambs? Should I look at ewes? And what number is a good starting number? Should I go out and buy the whole flock and get 500 of them? Should I buy 5? Yeah. Go big or go home. I mean, come on.
You know, if you want to stay married and have a good marriage, I'd say don't go buy the whole flock right away. That is
okay, that's good advice.
Also, make sure that your spring is kind of open for your first lambing season, right? And that you enjoy working with them. I guess that's a really important component. I always recommend, Jeremiah, that we probably start with some freezer lambs to see how they fit into our system, right? Buy 1 or 2 or 3 freezer lambs. I wouldn't recommend just buying one. Sheep are gregarious critters and they want to be with something. So I'd 2 or more to start with. But I know that sounds very subtle getting into the business, but the reality is you want to see how your facilities work. You want to see how your grass holds up. You want to see if it fits your lifestyle, because the idea of raising sheep oftentimes is much more enjoyable than doing it yourself for certain people. But the other aspect is you can raise, you can get in slowly and expand much more easily than you can go all in and try to liquidate and make it work. Mm-hmm.
When you say freezer sheep, you are raising those animals for meat.
Yes, I apologize.
Okay.
Great question.
No, that's okay. Just to clarify.
Yeah, so you're buying some lambs, some feeder lambs essentially, or how old do I need to be looking for those? Should I be looking for bum lambs right now?
In the springtime, yeah, that's a good option for you. There's a lot of bums available, starting anywhere from January and going until May for our shed lambers. They're usually done by the end of April at the latest. But yeah, bum lambs are a good way to get it. In the fall, access to feeder lambs, that's when a lot of our larger flocks are taking their sheep off of their grazing allotments, or they're coming in closer to home on winter ground, and that's when they wean their lambs. And so buying one from an auction barn is a decent way to get started as well. But usually feeder lambs are more available in the late summer, early fall.
Okay. And so if I get some lambs, say some bum lambs this spring, how long do I need to hold that? Does it need to become 4 or 5 years old before I can put it in the freezer? No. What am I looking?
Yeah, good question. So if you were to purchase bum lambs, I think immediately you want to have some access to some good creep feed that you could get from your feed store, a generic creep lamb diet would be worthwhile. You know, you can wean those bum lambs at about 45 days, as early as 30, but I recommend novice sheep producers, probably 45 should be the earliest. But if you have good feed in with them as you're feeding them milk, when you transition off of milk and you wean them, you know, you could have finished lambs in as little as 4 months, depending on how quickly they grow. But usually our harvest weight is around 100, depending on the breed, 110 to 150 pounds. And that's not hard to do within 6 months.
And so basically, if I pick one up now, you know, September, October, those lambs are ready, hopefully finished if I've done everything fairly well, and ready to slaughter. And so that's probably your recommendation to start with freezer lambs, is because it's a short-term commitment, right?
Yes, it is, absolutely. And I think the profitability, I mean, having a local meat source, especially now, is beneficial. Clearly, it allows you to kind of investigate your markets a little bit. Because if you're a small flock operator and you're going to produce 30 lambs a year, in some of our rural communities, that's pretty hard to market all those lambs in that rural area. So yeah, I really think that is the best way to get started. The other option is to buy some older ewes that you know, 6-7-year-old ewes that still have good udders and that have raised lambs. What I don't recommend is buying a bunch of yearling ewes if you've never worked with sheep before and lambing all those yearling ewes out your first year. They're still learning. They're young sheep, and that's probably not the best way to break you into raising sheep.
So a 3-year-old or older ewe might have more experience and not need as much assistance, and can get you some experience down the road.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, another good aspect that I should mention is on a lot of our big range flocks, these older ewes, they call them smooth mouth ewes or broken mouth ewes. And all that means is that their teeth have worn down enough that they're probably not as productive on rangeland environments. But a lot of those older ewes have 4 or 5 more years to go left in their life, productive, good years. And so in the past, those older sheep from the West used to go back to the Midwest, and they were raised on really high quality, you know, kind of like a retirement plan for those sheep. They had a good life, things were provided for them. And that's an option for producers even in our area. In small farm flock on irrigated acres, buying some of those older ewes for $100 a head or around $100 a head, bringing them back to your operation and getting 3 or 4 more lamb crops out of them. It's a really, really profitable way to get into the sheep business that we have seen a lot of younger producers utilize in these past couple of years.
So now, Whit, you mentioned that I want to find a ewe that has really good udder qualities. What does that mean?
Yeah, so when those sheep are weaned, that udder involutes and it sucks back closer up to the animal, and it's not a full bag anymore when that animal's not lactating. And so that's probably when you'd be evaluating the sheep, because most of the older sheep that we would buy from these operations shouldn't have a lot of bag tissue. So I guess what I'm looking for is you want to make sure that the teats aren't excessively large. After those sheep have been weaned, that bag should involute up back to the animal and not be a lot of tissue to grab onto. So just the basic palpation with your hand. If you fail to get a big handful, that's probably a pretty good thing. And also just the length of the teats. I mean, as those udders swell and begin producing milk, if the teats are too big, those lambs can't latch onto them easily, and you have to intervene and help them a lot. So small teat size, making sure when the sheep are dry, that there's just not a whole lot to grab onto, is a pretty good generic evaluation. And also looking out for lumps, because much like in the dairy cattle industry, mastitis or infection of the mammary gland occurs, and once those heal, you'll feel these large knots in the bag. So you want to try and stay away from those as well. So
the bag should feel kind of soft, no hard lumps or anything in there. Then teat size, you keep saying small, but put me in relevance of small, like as small as my thumb, as small as
I'd
my
say your thumb
finger.
is a probably good rule of thumb there. You don't want it to be 2 or 3 of your thumbs, and that can happen. Again, you'll be purchasing those sheep once they've weaned lambs. So really, if you're not getting a huge handful, that's a good thing. That's a good thing because that means they have involuted correctly, or they've healed up correctly, and they're ready for their next lactation.
Okay, great. Where do we want to go next? So I think a couple things we haven't really talked about is water. So I have to have some access to water. How much water do I need for these animals? Do they go through gallons and gallons and gallons, or can I feed them out of a thimble?
Yeah.
Whit, you should know I unshared you so we could see you a little better in
Okay.
between. So you'll have to reshare out if you want to show us
Share
something.
one more time.
Okay.
Well, we'll share a couple of times. That's a great question.
And then probably the next question to follow up after water is food, right? What should I be looking at in transition? And we probably want to talk that freezer lamb, and then also those older ewes.
So generally speaking, we look at water consumption without getting too technical. A good rule of thumb is to keep at least 2 gallons per ewe out there. I mean, obviously, when the ewe is gestating and lactating, she's going to need more water than when she's dry. She's not raising lambs. Lambs have been weaned, and she's undergoing what we call maintenance. So anywhere from 3/4 of a gallon all the way up to 3 is where we'd see. And so clean water, making sure that you provide clean water and in excess. Sheep can be picky. Obviously, much like, well, I'll drink a milkshake till it's gone, but I was trying to provide an example of sometimes we leave some stuff on our plate, right? Or we leave some stuff in the protein shake bottle, and sheep will do the same thing. It's just important to provide more than necessary. I put together a generic kind of feed budget on this next slide. How much hay and pasture? And this is very, very simplistic, but this is where we all have to start. We have to determine what is available for feed and what that is going to cost us. So here on this table, without getting too busy, I mentioned the fact that different stages of production, whether that animal is lactating or carrying lambs or she's not doing anything, they have different requirements in terms of how much they eat. So we often look at that as a % of their body weight. So I won't tell you how much I weigh, but if I was a ewe, I'd be a pretty large ewe. And I would be consuming, if I wasn't raising lambs, it'd be 1.7% of my body weight. And so for this example, I took a 150-pound ewe, which is a good moderate-sized ewe, times 0.017. That gives me about 3.1 pounds if I add in some hay wastage there. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah,
so
it really does.
Right there, if you're paying $180 a ton, which may seem high, but when you're buying in small quantities on a small operation, that's not too out of the realm of possibility. You can see that it's about 31 cents when that ewe isn't doing much. If I was just feeding her hay, clear up to 57 cents a day or more when she's milking and raising those lambs. So that kind of gives you an idea of what you're going to have into that ewe.
And so this is for a ewe. This wouldn't be for our freezer lambs that we were talking about earlier.
No, but
these are.
Yeah, so our freezer lambs, we can use a generic example. If they'll eat 3% of their body weight, a good high energy diet, and so that would probably approximate roughly, anywhere from 35 to 75 cents a day to finish those lambs, which isn't terrible.
No, very reasonable, right? And even if you throw, let's say, five head out there to do that, you're still doing really well. And on a ewe for the maintenance diet here, you're $1.50 a day.
Yeah.
That's way better than a cow or a horse. I can tell you that. Absolutely.
And then add in the multiple lamb potential there, right? If that ewe's raising twins, that quickly becomes a really profitable enterprise. Now, I have to put the caveat there is that always grazing and standing forage resources that we'd have on pasture or range are generally about 1/3 of the cost. So this scenario even looks better if you have access to grazing operations. And I recommend that for those periods of maintenance. I mean, that's a large part of the year. You can shift your enterprise. If you're thinking about producing lambs, you wean those lambs early and then get those ewes to your neighbor's place to manage some vegetation. That's a really, really good strategy because you've kept the lambs, you've weaned them, you have them on a diet in your barnyard, and then you've got your ewes out there managing vegetation. And I was going to show you an example of that targeted grazing. Did that answer your question though?
No, totally. I think so. And I guess I even think, like, if I own 5 acres or maybe 10 acres, I might be able to do this all on my own place. They might be able to have access to maybe 4 acres of pasture, and I might have like a small pen, of half an acre that they can have access, kind of dry lot, and I'd supplemental feed with some hay. So you could kind of scale that to whatever fits your individual situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think if you're positioned and have good relationships with your neighbors, there's a lot of grazing ground, as I mentioned earlier, that just goes underutilized and is essentially a nice fine fuel for fire. And that's an aspect that I was going to point out. I mentioned at the beginning of this, the really high input, high productivity type scenario. This is an example of kind of an outside of the box targeted grazing business. Before I came here, I was at Montana State, and I worked with an older gentleman who used that electronet fence that I was telling you about, and focused on grazing small acreage properties or areas that were considered high risk for wildfires in the Gallatin Valley of Montana. And Riley, he was not a spring chicken by any means. Him and his wife have been doing this for years, but in good health. But again, his business enterprise was not necessarily to breed the ewes, raise the lambs. His was to take on consignment yearling sheep that were coming into their first breeding season that weren't quite raising a lamb yet, in instances where the ranches ran out of grass. And so he would charge those producers a pretty competitive 16 cents per head per day. He would take those in for the summer months and graze these small acreages. And then he would charge the landowner about $5 per head per month to go in and manage the vegetation. So he was providing a service for the ranchers that didn't have the grass. And he was also providing a service for vegetation management, not having to spray those crops, manage it from a more sustainable perspective. And so he took in about 1,100 head of yearlings a year, but this is a terrible pixelated example, but you can at least see that this isn't an interpretive drawing on my part. This behind in the trees there at the top of this image is actually a high-end subdivision, a pretty expensive subdivision in Bozeman. It's surrounded by about 400 acres of grass, kind of a buffer and a scenic rolling hills. And so he would have some sheep in there for 2 or 3 months grazing this really lush perennial grass pasture. And you can see the electronet fence at the bottom of that image. He would set up 2 contiguous paddocks at a time so that when he would go out there, he could maximize how much labor he had to put into it. He would move the sheep. He already had the pasture next to him set up with water. And it was a really good system. But, I mean, look at the cash flow example. I think this is just the math based off the figures he gave me. But for 5 months of doing this targeted grazing, he had generated $53,000. Now, it's not all gravy there, right? I mean, there's some costs.
Sure. But he doesn't have much into it, right? So he does not, if I understand correctly, Whit, he does not own the sheep. He is just leasing the sheep from a producer that is short on pasture, right? Yep. And running it for them on their behalf. And so once he's done with his grazing season, those sheep go back to the owner.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And so he's provided those services, but he's provided some pretty good cash flow. And, I asked him about this because at the time I was considering it myself. I mean, it's a pretty good opportunity, I think, for those folks that don't want some of the risk associated with owning the sheep themselves. I mean, his greatest complaint was that he was getting older and it was becoming a challenge to do that and set it up. But he had a system in place that was really effective and it worked. And I think there's opportunities for these out there with some fine tuning and some management. But what a good story we could tell as a sheep industry that, I mean, we oftentimes always say goats are the best at controlling shrubs and invasive plants, but sheep are really good at it themselves.
I was going to ask you about that because you mentioned fire control, but they can also be utilized for weed control. Is that correct?
Absolutely. A lot of the real targeted grazing of spotted knapweed is done with both goats and sheep, but leafy spurge especially, that's a species that has taken over a lot of river bottoms and drainages, and sheep have been used very effectively to utilize that and control it pretty effectively. Not to eliminate it, but again, some of the gains that we see from the research that has been done, especially out of Montana State, I mean, 31% crude protein in some of these forbs, these invasive species, is better than hay.
Even though they're a weed dust, right? They're still a highly nutritious forage available to the right animal of a goat or a sheep. So I'm thinking like in a subdivision, and I see it up in my area. I'm sure it's all around the state, but you're in town almost with these, right? You might be considered county, but you're in subdivisions, small ranchette setting. Now, what would be the obnoxiousness of having a flock of sheep in the backyard, or maybe the lack of obnoxiousness?
You know, that I'm glad you asked that question, because I asked him the same question, and he said actually the opposite is true to some extent. Some of these folks that maybe don't have a real understanding of animal agriculture, they really enjoyed having those sheep close by. And what he found and observed is that these folks in the subdivisions or these ranchettes actually kept a really good eye on the sheep and were the first to call if something went wrong, did a really good job of keeping out dogs and other predators, and it actually was pretty beneficial. Now, part of sheep production is sheep dye, and if you haven't been around animal agriculture a lot, that is often a tough pill for some to swallow, that livestock dye. And so that was the only complaint that he would have stated, is that if a lamb or a ewe died, he knew about it right away, and there wasn't always a clear understanding of why from the landowner's perspective. But that was a minor complaint that he had.
How about in terms of smell or noise?
Yeah, since those animals aren't spending a tremendous amount of time there, once the vegetation is gone or managed to the level that one would want, those are out of there. And so there might have been some fly issues, but usually speaking, there was a buffer zone that these weren't right 30 feet away from a house or a dwelling. They had some space between those, but wasn't a huge problem. And I think what really was interesting is the landowners commented that the regrowth and the health of the vegetation after harvesting some of that lower quality invasive forbs was really noticeable. And he had landowners taking pictures and highlighting the fact that was, the grass looked better than it ever had. And so
trying to encourage the neighbors to do the same.
Yes. Good peer pressure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I
Anyway,
guess I'd almost think like with sheep, they have very small feces, right? Small pellets. It's very different than a cow that has a big cow pie patties out there and that. So you don't see that as much. And I would speculate, depends on how long they're there for, you're not going to have a feed yard or a feedlot type smell coming from that. And so it just interfaces in that type of environment very well.
Yeah, the physiology of sheep, they're really efficient with water. They take it out of every aspect of what they're digesting. So there's very little water content in those feces. So you nailed it. It's a pellet. Yes, if you chewed on it, it wouldn't taste good and it would smell. But for the most part, it's much less offensive than a lot of the alternatives. Mm-hmm.
You've done a lot of things, Jeremiah. You haven't done that, have you?
I'm going to plead the fifth on that one.
I may or may not have had a 2-year-old of mine partake at one point in time, but I won't confirm or deny that. This is live.
So we had a question now. You talked about water and feed and things that are needed by sheep. What about shelter?
Yeah.
Ooh, good question.
Really good question. So, generally speaking, sheep, because we keep a fleece on them during the more challenging winter months of the year. A way to minimize wind is probably the minimum that we try to strive for in sheep production systems. So a good windbreak. I know there's many operations that are successful with just a 3-sided windbreak that's strategically placed, based on prevailing wind patterns on the farm. That's a minimum. I think if you are going to be in the lambing side of things, it's important that you have an enclosed shelter that you can at least have some electricity to and some water to, so that if you're lambing ewes, you can put in a good fireproof heat lamp or some other climate controlled aspects of the lambing shed. So, but if you're a feed yard or if you're just wanting to raise some market lambs, making sure that you shear those, later a little bit later in the spring if you don't have windbreak opportunities. But for the most part, the majority of our commercial operations, we raise sheep breeds that are well suited to the Wyoming climates, have really dense fleeces, really good ability to thermoregulate. And so those actually spend a lot of time on winter range. If you've driven past Rock Springs and Rollins, that's some of the best winter sheep range that we have left in the U.S. A lot of sheep are raised on that winter range and do exceptionally well in Wyoming's harsh production climate.
Whit, you mentioned some breeds. What breeds are here being raised in the area, or that I should be looking at that would do well here and can tolerate? I don't have to supplemental heat them right for the winter, and they can tolerate our conditions a little better.
Yeah, I have to be careful. I found that each sheep producer that raises their breed of sheep raises the best breed of sheep, right? It's much
Right.
like talking
Always.
about politics and religion. Yeah. Let me say, generally speaking, to not be in trouble with any of my producers in the state, a Western white-faced sheep is a fine wool breed of sheep that is made up of purebreds like the Rambouillet. A U.S. breed that was developed from the Rambouillet is called the Targhee and the Columbia. Again, fine to medium wool type sheep breeds that are well suited to our environment. Those are kind of our standard Western white-faced sheep that are really well acclimated. That being said, many producers will use meat type breeds, Suffolk and Hampshire breeds, and cross those on those white-faced sheep breeds to produce a crossbred lamb that is both excellent in survivability, but also carcass characteristics and growth characteristics. So that's the traditional sheep industry. I think the emerging demographic that I mentioned is hair sheep producers. And, there's not a whole lot of scientific data to compare the two in terms of their ability to overwinter really well. I think there are hair sheep that do well, and I know of producers that raise them in pretty challenging conditions and they do okay. And those breeds are primarily a Dorper or a Katahdin or a Royal White. And most of those, the Dorper was originated in South Africa, and it's been well acclimated to all parts of the world. It's not as parasite resistant as the Katahdin is, which is a hair sheep that was developed in Maine of the U.S., but they're really hardy. And honestly, those sheep breeds have allowed us to expand the U.S. sheep industry back in the East Coast, unlike some of our wool breeds have been able to do.
Great. Hey, Whit, we got a question from Michael, and we're going to jump back to grazing acreage. But he says his question is, what is a good rule of thumb for sheep per acre capacity?
Okay. So let's go back to that feed slide. Can I share my screen again?
Yeah.
All right. So I'll take a generic example. I mean, it depends on the productivity of your site, right? If you went to the Soil Web Survey or your local extension office and got a good idea of what your productive potential is of that certain acreage, you can expect that on a dry matter basis, which depending on the time of the year, 7 to 8 pounds of pasture will be consumed per ewe per day or per sheep per day. You'd have to do some calculations to determine, if you have 10 sheep eating 7 pounds to 8 pounds of pasture per day, how long that pasture would last you, and also to what extent you want to harvest all of the grass on that pasture. I think, a rule of thumb that we've always used is take half, leave half. If you're managing invasive grasses and there's a large amount of, cheatgrass or invasive forbs on that pasture, you can probably utilize it a little bit more. So I say the first step is to estimate what the production potential is. And then assuming that a sheep will eat, 7 pounds of pasture, generally speaking, that's 50% dry matter, that will kind of give you an estimate. But it really does depend. Is this a sagebrush steppe plant community, or is it a sub-irrigated meadow with a high density of perennial grasses? I mean, the production potential really is the deciding factor there.
No, that's great, Whit. And so, like getting into an irrigated hayfield, right? If I'm grazing that, you would expect to be able to maybe even leave the sheep in longer or put more head on it for the same amount of time.
Absolutely.
Essentially. Okay. So in comparison, maybe we're a little more familiar with cattle. In comparison, we consider an AUM, right? An animal unit per month. as one cow and her calf at her side. What
Yeah.
is there a correlation to sheep with that?
Yeah, so sheep represent approximately 0.2 AUM, so they're about 5 sheep per 1 cow. And I've got actually some information to point to that real quick.
So I was going to mention that folks, if they're trying to figure out how much production they have on their place, are really good folks to contact is their local extension office. We have folks in most offices that can help you through that process of figuring it out.
Absolutely. That's the first step. I guess I'm always hesitant because your local experts have a better idea of what can be done with knowledge of what that land is able to produce. So that's a really good point. So, you know, the 5 sheep to 1 cow, this isn't necessarily, can you see my screen? I'll put it up.
Make it bigger.
Yeah, there we go. So, and you all of you educators are aware of this resource, USDA NASS, the state grazing fees and per animal unit. What I usually do is I take that estimate of an animal unit, divide it by 5 sheep, and that gives me a cost per head per month. That's been my approach to establishing these grazing fees, or what you would pay, or a baseline price point, right? I mean, it is so different. And anytime I talk about costs of pasture fees, I get annihilated. So I'm not going to go there, but I will say this. I will say that this is a good starting point, because whether the information is accurate or not, this is the data that is reported. So it may be inflated, but it's a good starting point. And I've talked with a lot of producers that are incorporating their grazing into neighboring cattle operations. And this is a really good resource to remember, because it at least gets everyone on the same page as a starting point as to what it would cost for those pasture arrangements.
Great. Appreciate it, Whit.
So one of the questions I have is, you know, we've talked about feed and we've talked about water and shelter and different types of sheep. What, you know, are there vet issues that folks need to be aware of? Are there diseases? Are there other things that can come in that they need to jump on immediately, or are there just things that sheep just die from?
Yeah. So sheep health issues, contrary to what the dogma is that sheep just are looking for a place to die. I'm sure you've heard that before.
They're born dyers, right?
Yeah,
I have.
Yeah. I counter that with the fact that their threshold before they're really clinically ill and you're able to recognize it when they're dead is really short, because they can hide it that long. So sheep are extremely resilient creatures, but there are some significant considerations when it comes to animal health. I think part of when we think of starting a sheep enterprise, much like what we want to determine our goals are to determine our local practitioner, our local veterinarian, visit with him, talk with him about his ability to help you with your sheep production enterprise. I mean, all of our vets are very competent practitioners, but there are some that, given the frequency of the amount that they work with sheep, some are more knowledgeable than others. I'd encourage you also to reach out to your local sheep producers. There is no better group of agricultural producers in our country than sheep producers, because they're so willing to share their knowledge. And all the successful operations, newly emerging sheep operations, have established with a mentor, a relationship with a sheep producing mentor early on. Because those questions like, I don't know how to tube feed this lamb with a stomach tuber, right? The sheep producer has done that before. Or you prolapsed, what do I do? You know, and just having someone to bounce those questions off of is extremely important. Some of the questions require a greater degree of expertise, but some sheep producers have dealt with every year in and out, and they know the solution. So a good relationship with your veterinarian, but even more so a great relationship with an area producer or a mentor is just so valuable. So a couple of things to think about. Going back to grazing, internal parasites are a real challenge in the sheep industry, especially on irrigated acres. Not so much on our range operations, but allowing, with your grazing plan, allowing some rest periods so that the larvae can die off once they've been deposited on the pasture. So 35, 40-day rest period. So if you've got a good rotationally grazing system, establishing your paddock or your pasture size to accommodate that, making sure that you vaccinate your ewes with a good Clostridial, a CD&T vaccine late in pregnancy, that you will put all those antibodies into the colostrum and protect the lamb early on. And so, you know, access to those knowledgeable producers to help you have that flock calendar and things planned is really important. Last thing I'll mention is the Sheep Industry Handbook is produced by the American Sheep Industry Association. It's at sheepusa.org. Again, it's a large text, but it is the authoritative go-to quick reference manual, I think, for the U.S. sheep industry to answer those questions. And I'd encourage, if you are in the sheep business and you don't have it, make that investment. It is just a really good resource. And then, of course, your extension educators and myself, you know, our network is pretty seamless, I feel like. Sometimes we struggle to get back to producers when I'm influxed with a tremendous amount of calls, but our extension network, that's what we're there for, is to answer those questions. And if we don't have the answer immediately, we have the network to get the answer without charging you for it, without any ulterior motives of making money off of your decisions. And that's really important, I think.
Great, appreciate it, Whit. We have another question. Thank you, Heather, for steering us right around to a good topic that we have kind of missed, but we haven't talked about breeding. And so her question is, you've talked about feeders and ewes, but not rams. Will you talk about when you need to add a ram, or can you borrow one at breeding time, and how many ewes can that ram cover? And so, yeah, what's the gestation period? How do we sync these ewes? How do we get them ready for breeding? How do we plan when we want our lambs to drop? Let's chat about that before we finish up.
Yeah, so I put this table together with just some broad metrics as to what we would experience, you know, age at puberty, so when our ewe lambs would be receptive.
Just share it out. I unshared you again.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, let's see here.
The iron-fisted Jenny rules again.
I love it.
I like to see your faces occasionally.
Everybody else does too, I think.
Okay, I might have lost it. Let's see here. Okay, so can you see this now?
Yep.
Yes.
All right, good.
Just make it bigger, Whit. There we go.
So generally speaking, depending on breeds, obviously this is very breed dependent, are really prolific ewes that from breeds that give us lots of twins and triplets. They mature a little earlier, so they're receptive to breeding as early as 4 months of age. 7 months is probably an average. Most sheep producers do not expose ewes to breed here in Wyoming until they're over 1 year of age, but ewe lambs can breed, and that's a really good management strategy. Their estrus cycle is an average of 17 days. Again, there's a range depending on breed. How long they're receptive to the ram is about 30 hours. And then
so hold on a little bit, Whit.
Yep.
For somebody such as myself that doesn't deal in this every day.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're saying is, I need to have that ram in there with that ewe for at least probably 19, 20 days to catch 2 different cycles.
Well, minimum, I'd say about 30 to catch those 2 cycles. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, depending if it's a younger ewe group that needs maybe 3 cycles, but generally speaking, 2 cycles is adequate. Again, depending on how long you want to suffer through lambing or enjoy through lambing, depends on how many cycles you should have that ram out.
Okay.
Again, I love lambing time, but I also know that I don't love it for a solid 60 days.
So if I only put a ram in for 18 days, then I've only exposed those ewes for 1 cycle to that ram, and my chances of being bred up 100% is lower.
It's lower. I mean, I think the majority should be taking on that first cycle, especially if they're mature, older ewes. The other thing to think about is that certain sheep breeds are responsive to shortening day length, right? They're more receptive, more fertile as the days get shorter. That's an important component. Some breeds are not as affected by that, but a lot of the most popular breeds we work with are considered seasonal sheep breeds. And so beginning as the days start getting shorter, most of our producers with 147 days of pregnancy are turning out rams to breed in November and December. But that's an important consideration, is how long do you want to be lambing, and that should determine how long you keep your rams out. But I think
Okay.
it asks a little bit much to just keep them out 18 days and hope that you have a 95% breed up. Usually you want to give them at least 2 cycles, 30 something days.
Great. So now this duration of estrus, or the heat, right, is during that cycle when that ewe is cycling, she has 30 hours where she is available for breeding, essentially, correct?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
And so this is more important. I mean, rams will do their work, but many of our club flocks have synchronized or use synchronization protocols to either time AI their sheep, or laparoscopically AI their sheep, or just to really just, if you are a part-time operator, there's synchronization protocols where you put in a seeder for 7 days. This is an internal device that allows the ewes to synchronize and ovulate, and they can back calculate from the calendar so that it corresponds to vacation for work or time off that they may have otherwise, or when their kids are home from college. And so
Or to the weekend, right, when I'm available.
Yes. I mean, you've got to be really good to get it that time.
Oh, you're breaking my heart, Whit. I thought we had this dialed in.
Well, anything to get people in the sheep business, more people in the sheep business. But I think a lot of our operators do have part-time jobs or full-time jobs from the sheep enterprise, and so they've utilized easy breed seeders to help synchronize that and really time when their sheep breed, and then they can have a better idea of when the lambing would start.
And so that'll be the bulk of the lambing. It won't be all of that lambing, but the big push of it will be hopefully during that time period.
Yep. Now back to the ram aspect. Usually our ewe to ram, ram to ewe ratio, we all know rams are excellent breeders. They have a really high concentrated semen, and they can cover a lot of ewes, but oftentimes we don't want to extend our rams, and also have the chance of certain rams not breeding ewes. So generally speaking, 1 ram to 35 to 40 ewes is pretty standard. We know, we have data that shows that 1 ram can breed up to 150 ewes very easily. And there's dominant ewes. But I recommend
holy sheep, Jeremiah.
Holy sheep is right.
Sorry.
Yes.
I didn't mean to offend you there, Whit.
So if you're able to, again, going back to having a relationship with your vet, making sure that your rams, doing a breeding soundness exam, that those rams do have good semen characteristics, that are physically able to travel and breed those ewes, that's an important part of preparing the ram for breeding season. Because if you have a ram out there that has some defects and is unable to breed the ewes, that's a very expensive assumption to make that he's going to go out and do it when we haven't tested him. Usually, I recommend producers, especially with black-faced sheep breeds, Suffolk, Hampshire sheep breeds, that they don't test those rams until the days start getting shorter. Those are very seasonal sheep breeds. And so if we test those rams too early in the summertime, we may get some false negatives that they are not very fertile, when in fact they would be if the day length was a little shorter.
Great. So, and now that breed up, that ratio of ram to ewes is really going to depend on my individual situation. So I'm guessing on a rangeland situation, large pasture, right, I need to maybe a little more conservative on those numbers, go to the lower side of that. But if I'm on a 5 acres or 10 acres, I could maybe push that to the higher end, like you were saying, 40 or 45 ewes per ram. Is that a good way or rule of thumb to think of that?
Yeah, I think for range flocks, we're closer to 3 rams per 100 ewes. That's kind of a rule of thumb that we use, because again, they have to be able to identify those receptive ewes on a pretty challenging landscape. The other time that we would increase the number of rams to ewes is for maiden ewes, first-time breeding ewes. They don't settle as quickly as some of these mature ewes would, and so it requires having a little bit more ram power. Ram lambs that are less than a year of age can breed ewes. We try not to overdo it on ram lambs early on because they are still growing. And so that ratio looks closer to a 1 ram lamb to every 15, 20 ewes max. And if they are in a pasture with older, more dominant rams, that can also limit their ability to breed of those younger rams as well. But a mature 4 or 5-year-old ram, there's no excuse for them not to be covering at least 35 ewes.
Okay. So you talked about covering 2 or 3 cycles, right? So we're looking at 30 to maybe 45 days of that ram being in with those ewes. Now what do I do with that ram?
Yeah, that's probably why that question came up.
Give him back.
There are some infectious organisms that if we are sharing our rams without kind of screening the animal health status of some of the flocks that we're sharing rams with, we can actually introduce some organisms that can reduce fertility. Brucella ovis is one of those. And so, sharing rams, again, have a relationship with the person you're sharing it with. If they're buying and selling sheep from all over the region, that's probably not a ram that after loaning it out, you want to give back. There's too many unknowns there. But if it's a good animal health protocol in the flock that you are loaning that ram to, I don't see a problem with that at all. But that does raise a good question. I mean, rams can be dangerous. It depends on the ram, but that's a management consideration. To raise one sheep alone by itself for the rest of the year presents some logistical and some cost challenges. And so I know a lot of our smaller farm flocks do have some co-ops and agreements with people that they do lease out rams, and it works well. But I caution folks to make sure that all of those participating in that sharing agreement all are on the same page with the health status and have somewhat of a closed flock where they're not bringing in all kinds of sheep from different operations.
So I think you just answered my next thought or question would be, so I probably don't want to take my ewes to the ram, right? So I don't want to lease pasture from a neighbor that is already breeding their sheep. I don't want to do that maybe. I definitely want to bring that ram to me.
I would. I think there's infectious organisms that we just have to be on top of. And I think a good closed flock strategy with exceptions, with very similarly managed flocks, is just a safeguard against other issues that can occur. I mean, foot rot or foot issues are a problem in more wetter, more temperate environments. Where I did my master's at Oregon State on the grass seed fields, they get a tremendous amount of moisture in Western Oregon, and foot rot is an issue there. And if one is not very thoughtful in where they're buying replacement ewes or rams from, you could introduce a problem and be out of business really quickly. And so it does require adhering to good protocols. We're lucky here in the West that we run sheep in an arid environment. Sheep have evolved and been developed and domesticated in very arid environments. And that's the beauty that we have here in Wyoming, is that sheep do really well in those arid environments. And disease issues, we don't see the large spectrum of diseases in these arid environments that we see in some more of those humid environments.
Sure.
What else do we need to finish up on breeding, gestation, anything else that we didn't cover real quickly, Whit?
There's a lambing checklist in the sheep industry handbook, and there's resources online. But if you are going to start a sheep enterprise where you anticipate lambing sheep, make sure you're set up well in advance. Don't be setting up a week before you expect lambs, because lambs come a week before they're supposed to sometimes. And I mean, that goes back to making sure that you have a good tube feeder. An esophageal feeder we use to put colostrum in the belly of those lambs early on, because that time point is really critical that they get colostrum to protect them. Have that on hand. Have your heat lamps ready to go. Have your jug set up. A jug is a 4x5 or 4x4 pen where we put the ewe with her lambs to bond them in the first 24 hours. Have all those things ready to go before you pull the trigger. I'm a big fan of doing things proactively rather than reactively, because you want to be fulfilled in your sheep enterprise. And sheep are just marvelous creatures that teach you so much beyond just the dollars that you make from them. But if you're not set up for them, it's more of a headache than anything.
Great. So we got 2 more questions to finish us up here at the end of the show, Whit. And I'll do this one first, since it relates to what we've just been talking about. If you have 5 ewes, would it be more cost effective to use AI than a ram?
Very rarely is it more cost effective to use AI, unless your whole system is built upon more of a club lamb enterprise, or you're selling $1,000 lambs out of these stud genetics. So I always recommend, that would be a perfect scenario of leasing a ram from your neighbor. that would warrant it. Again, AI is good, but it's not 100%, 65, 70%, and it's an invasive procedure in sheep, unlike cattle. In South America, they do use some less invasive methods, but it's not practiced widely up here. And so unless there's a very specific reason you're AIing your sheep, I don't recommend that.
Okay. And the last one, and this one's from Diane, are sheep used for milk and cheese production like goats and dairy cows?
Absolutely, yes. Sheep has some very unique qualities. Sheep milk does have some very unique qualities that lend itself to excellent cheese production. I am not a great expert on milk production. We did have a dairy in western Nebraska that I'm not sure if they're still operating. There's the Dairy Sheep Producers Association of America that has good references there. The real challenge with producing sheep milk for cheese is that there's some pretty important food safety requirements and laws that need to be met before we embark on that. And the upfront investment requires some work, but yeah, I'd be happy to help where I can with the dairy sheep interest. I'm more of a nutritionist than I am anything else, and dairy sheep nutrition is a fine art. It requires some good nutrition, and so yeah, I'd point them to those sources.
Great. Well,
Diane also had a second part to that question.
Oh, it did?
She wants to know why sheep don't shrink when they get wet.
It's never hot in Wyoming. How about that?
The wool will felt, yeah, if there's a high rainfall environment. But I didn't talk a lot about wool today, but boy, talk about a miracle fiber. Synthetic polyester type fibers have tried to be mimicking wool's excellent characteristics, but wool is just an outstanding fiber, and we have a great resource in our state. I'd encourage everyone to visit Mountain Meadow Wool out of Buffalo, Wyoming. They actually custom process small lots of wool. They're turning it into excellent products. Wool is biodegradable. Until recently, wool was at historic highs. And from a dual product perspective, wool and meat production and dairy production from sheep really give us a great story to tell. Clearly, I'm biased. I'm a sheep guy. But if you're not wearing wool socks and you haven't purchased the new generation of wool socks, you're treating your feet wrong. I'd encourage you to go out and buy those. Farm to Feet, Darn Tough, Duckworth, they're companies that are manufacturing here in the U.S., and they're using American wool where it's possible. And man, can't beat wool. I should have spent. Let's do another one of these and just talk about wool.
We can definitely, Whit. Yeah, we really appreciate you being on the show today. We definitely will want to bring you back for other topics, and one could be wool. That would be excellent. But yeah, we're out of time today, and we really appreciate everybody joining us on this Zoom call and also on live on Facebook. Just to wrap us up here real quick, Jenny, if you wouldn't mind sharing your slide, or closing out slide, to connect with us. So if you want to know more of these live shows, we're doing them 10 a.m. Wednesday and Friday every week. You can go to the URL on the left-hand side, so the barnyardsandbackyards.com. On that website, we have a tab for the Barnyards and Backyards Live, and we have a list of the shows that are coming up and the shows that we've already done, the times, and the links for you to join us. The other thing is like this show, once we're done, we've recorded this show, we're going to upload it to that link. So if you missed it, or if you want to share it with someone, or you want to watch it again because we're that engaging, go on there and look that up. Those will be there. Also, resources that were highlighted, we're going to get up as many of those resources up on that link too, so you can get right there, kind of a one-stop shop. The image on the right, so the URL on the right is to connect with any of your local extension offices in the state of Wyoming. So as Whit has pointed out several times, reach out to us. We're here. We want to help you. We'll help you on your individual situations and questions. So reach out to those individual county offices. And there's an office in every county in the state, and one on the Wind River Indian Reservation. the last thing I want to highlight is we want your feedback. We appreciate you taking the time and joining us. We need to hear from you. We want to hear how this is benefiting you and what we can do to help you better. And so we have an evaluation. For those that are in the Zoom meeting with us, you will be prompted and it'll be in your internet browser once you get out of this. For those on Facebook, I believe Jenny Thompson has put that in your Facebook comments in the Facebook Live. So please interact with us. Let us know how we're doing. With that, have a great weekend.
Thank you, Whit.
Whit, very much.
Welcome.
Thank you all for participating.